Trauma, when the past refuses to become the past. Reflection. Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. Joseph Breuer and Sigmund Freud, Studies on Hysteria, 1895. There are experiences that belong to the past, and there are experiences that have happened in the past but have never fully become past. The distinction is subtle, yet it lies close to the heart of psychological trauma. Ordinary memory allows us to return to what has happened while remaining anchored in the present. We remember a loss, a frightening moment, a humiliation, a period of helplessness, and although the memory may still hurt, we know that we are remembering. Time has placed a distance between the person we were then and the person who remembers now. Trauma can disturb this distance. A sound, a smell, a particular expression on another person's face, a bodily sensation, or sometimes something we cannot consciously identify may suddenly collapse the boundary between then and now. The body reacts before thought has had time to explain. The heart accelerates. Muscles tighten. Attention narrows. An impulse arises to flee, defend, freeze, or disappear. The calendar says that years may have passed. The organism responds as though the danger were still present. Perhaps this is one of the deepest paradoxes of trauma. The event ends, but something within the person continues to live in its time. The rupture of safety. Trauma is often described through events. War, violence, abuse, accidents, disasters, sudden loss, or other experiences in which life and bodily or psychological integrity are profoundly threatened. Such events matter enormously, yet an exclusively event-centered definition can obscure something essential. Trauma is not merely an event, but a rupture in the inner sense of safety. What is broken is not necessarily visible from the outside. Before trauma, most of us live with assumptions so fundamental that we rarely notice them. Tomorrow will resemble today. The ground beneath us will remain where it is. Familiar people will remain recognizable. Our body belongs to us. Other human beings are, within reasonable limits, predictable. There are places where we can lower our guard. The future exists and we are moving toward it. None of these assumptions is philosophically guaranteed, yet psychologically, we depend upon them. They form an invisible architecture of ordinary life. Traumatic experience can fracture that architecture. Afterward, danger may no longer be experienced simply as something that happened in one particular place at one particular time. It may become a possibility hidden everywhere. In relationships, in intimacy, in silence, in authority, in one's own body, or in the unpredictability of the next moment. This helps explain why two people may experience apparently similar events and emerge from them differently. The severity of an external event cannot, by itself, tell us everything about its psychological consequences. Developmental history, previous experiences, attachment, age, meaning, available support, the possibility of escape or action, and what happens after the event can all influence how experience becomes incorporated into a person's inner world. To understand trauma, therefore, we must ask more than, what happened? We must also ask, what happened to the person's relationship with safety? And perhaps even more deeply, what happened to the person's relationship with reality, with others, with the body, and with time itself? When an experience cannot become a memory. More than a century ago, the early investigators of psychological trauma encountered a peculiar phenomenon. Experiences that should have belonged to the past appeared to retain an unusual psychological power in the present. Pierre Janet approached this problem through his studies of dissociation and traumatic memory. Sigmund Freud, approaching it from another direction, later observed that traumatic experience could return repetitively, in dreams, symptoms, and patterns that seemed to resist the ordinary passage of time. Freud's image in Beyond the Pleasure Principle is particularly striking. He imagined the mind as possessing a kind of protective barrier against excessive stimulation. Trauma occurs when something overwhelms or breaches this protection. The psyche is confronted with more excitation than it can adequately bind, organize, or master. The language belongs to another era of psychology, but the intuition remains remarkably recognizable. A traumatic experience is not simply remembered. It may remain insufficiently integrated. Ordinary autobiographical memory has a place. It is connected with other memories and with a larger narrative. This happened to me then. I survived it. I am here now. Traumatic memory may behave differently. Fragments of sensation, affect, imagery, bodily states, or meaning may return without the full contextual framework that ordinarily tells us. This belongs to the past. The person does not necessarily choose to revisit the experience. At times, it is almost as though the experience revisits the person. This distinction is crucial. Remembering the past and reliving the past are not psychologically identical acts. In remembering, the present contains the past. In traumatic reliving, the past can temporarily invade the present. The body that remembers danger. This is also why trauma cannot be understood exclusively through conscious thought. A person may know perfectly well that a room is safe, that a particular individual poses no threat, or that an event occurred many years ago. Yet physiological systems involved in detecting and responding to danger do not operate solely through deliberate reasoning. The organism learns. It learns which sounds preceded danger, which expressions appeared before violence, which situations meant helplessness, which bodily sensations accompanied terror. Later, cues resembling elements of the original experience may activate defensive responses even when conscious appraisal says that no immediate threat exists. This does not mean that the body literally stores a complete narrative memory independently of the brain, as the phrase, "the body keeps the score," is sometimes loosely interpreted in popular psychology. Rather, traumatic learning can involve interconnected systems of memory, emotion, attention, perception, autonomic arousal, and defensive action. The distinction matters because trauma should neither be reduced to a purely intellectual memory nor surrounded by unnecessary mystification. Something more precise, and perhaps more remarkable, is occurring. A human being is an organism designed to learn from danger. The very mechanisms that once helped a person survive may later continue to respond when survival is no longer at stake. Hypervigilance may once have been necessary. Emotional numbing may once have made the unbearable bearable. Avoidance may have protected the person from overwhelming activation. Dissociation may have created psychological distance when physical escape was impossible. What later appears as a symptom may therefore contain the history of an adaptation. This does not make suffering less real, but it changes the question we ask. Instead of asking only, "What is wrong with this person?" we may also ask, "What did this mind once have to learn in order to survive?" And here we arrive at the threshold of another inner landscape. Because when an experience becomes too overwhelming to be integrated into the continuity of consciousness, the psyche sometimes attempts another solution. It separates. That is where our next exploration will begin, with dissociation and the divided self. Trauma and the fracture of time. Human beings do not merely exist in time. We organize ourselves through it. We remember where we have come from, experience ourselves in the present, and imagine a future toward which our lives are moving. From these threads, we construct something resembling continuity, the sense that the child we once were, the person we are today, and the person we may become tomorrow belong to one unfolding life. Trauma can disturb this continuity. This is why traumatic experience raises a question that is psychological, but also strangely philosophical. What does it mean for something to be over? Chronologically, the answer seems simple. An event occurred at a particular moment. It began, lasted for some period, and ended. Psychologically, matters are more complicated. An event may be over in chronological time, while remaining active in experiential time. A person who has survived violence may enter a safe room and still scan the exits. Someone who has lived for years in an unpredictable environment may experience calm not as reassuring, but as suspicious. A person who has suffered betrayal may encounter genuine affection and nevertheless wait for the moment when intimacy turns into abandonment or harm. In each case, the present is being interpreted partly through a world that no longer exists. The past has become a lens. And because we normally experience reality through the lens rather than seeing the lens itself, the response may feel completely appropriate to the present moment. This is one reason traumatic reactions can be so bewildering. A person may simultaneously inhabit two forms of knowledge. One says, "I know I am safe." The other says, "I am in danger." Both are real psychological experiences, but they belong to different systems of knowing. The first is contextual, reflective, and capable of placing events in time. The second is immediate, embodied, associative, and organized around survival. Healing requires more than convincing one of them that the other is mistaken. It requires restoring communication between them. The world before and the world after. Trauma can divide biography into two territories: before and after, before the accident, before the war, before the assault, before the diagnosis, before the death, before the betrayal, before the moment when something previously unimaginable became real. This division is not merely chronological. Traumatic experience can alter what a person believes is possible. Before certain experiences, we may know intellectually that human beings can be cruel, bodies can fail, relationships can collapse, and life can change without warning. Yet this knowledge remains abstract. Afterward, it may become existential. The world has revealed something about itself that cannot simply be unknown again. This is one reason the language of returning to normal can sometimes be misleading. There may be no complete return to the psychological world that existed before the event. The task may instead involve constructing a life in which what has been discovered about vulnerability can coexist with renewed trust, attachment, curiosity, and hope. Trauma, therefore, involves not only fear. It can involve loss. The loss of innocence. The loss of trust. The loss of an assumed future. The loss of a former identity. Sometimes even the loss of the person one believed oneself to be. A survivor may ask, "Why did I freeze? Why did I not leave? Why did I trust them? Why am I still affected by something that happened so long ago?" Such questions can become fertile ground for shame. Yet survival responses do not arise from a moral referendum conducted in the middle of danger. Under threat, human beings do not always behave according to the narratives they later construct about courage, strength, or choice. The nervous system has older priorities. Sometimes it fights. Sometimes it flees. Sometimes it freezes. Sometimes it submits, disconnects, or becomes strangely still. To judge these responses only from the safety of the present is to misunderstand the conditions under which they emerged. Trauma in relationship. Not all trauma comes from impersonal catastrophe. Some of the deepest wounds occur within relationships. This introduces a painful contradiction. Human beings regulate distress partly through other human beings. From infancy onward, safety is not merely the absence of danger. It is also the presence of someone with whom danger can be endured. Attachment gives fear somewhere to go. But what happens when the person who should provide safety is also the source of fear? The child cannot simply solve this contradiction by leaving. Psychological development depends upon proximity to caregivers, yet proximity itself may become dangerous, unpredictable, humiliating, or frightening. The mind is then confronted with an impossible equation. I need you in order to feel safe, but I am not safe with you. This dilemma helps us understand why developmental and relational trauma can reach beyond isolated memories and influence the organization of attachment, emotional regulation, self-worth, and expectations of others. The person may learn not simply that something dangerous happened, but that closeness itself is dangerous. Or that love must be earned. Or that anger leads to abandonment. Or that one's own needs are intolerable to others. Or that vigilance is the price of belonging. Such conclusions are rarely written consciously as propositions. They are learned through repetition and enacted through relationships. Later, they may appear in adult life as patterns whose origins are difficult to recognize. Someone longs intensely for intimacy, but withdraws when intimacy becomes possible. Someone repeatedly chooses unavailable partners. Someone interprets ordinary distance as rejection. Someone becomes excessively accommodating because disagreement once carried a terrible cost. Someone cannot rest in another person's affection because safety itself feels unfamiliar. In this sense, traumatic experience can become relational expectation. The past no longer needs to reproduce itself literally. It can reproduce itself through anticipation. When protection becomes a prison. This brings us to one of the most important principles in understanding psychopathology. A response can be adaptive in one context and destructive in another. Hypervigilance is useful in danger. Avoidance reduces immediate distress. Emotional numbing can protect against unbearable feeling. Control can create predictability in chaos. Withdrawal can prevent further injury. Dissociation can distance consciousness from what cannot presently be endured. The problem is not necessarily that these responses appeared. The problem is that they may continue after the conditions that created them have changed. The guard remains at his post long after the war has ended. And because his task is protection, asking him simply to disappear may itself feel dangerous. This is why psychological healing cannot be reduced to the elimination of symptoms. A symptom may be costly, painful, and maladaptive in the present, while still carrying the logic of an earlier attempt at survival. Understanding that logic does not mean romanticizing pathology. It means approaching it historically. The question becomes not only, what function does this symptom serve now? But also, under what circumstances did this response once make sense? That question changes the therapeutic encounter. Fear becomes something to understand rather than merely suppress. Avoidance becomes a strategy whose price can be examined. Shame can be separated from survival. And defensive patterns that once seemed irrational can gradually be recognized as remnants of an older psychological world. The goal is not to condemn the mind for having protected itself. The goal is to help it discover that protection no longer has to take the same form. Trauma is not a destiny. There is, however, an important boundary we must draw. To understand the power of trauma is not to make trauma the explanation for everything. Not every painful experience is traumatic in a clinical sense. Not every psychological symptom originates in trauma. And exposure to a potentially traumatic event does not inevitably lead to post-traumatic stress disorder or lifelong psychological damage. Human beings are vulnerable, but they are also remarkably adaptive. Many people recover without developing chronic psychopathology. Others continue to carry certain effects while living meaningful, creative, and deeply connected lives. Still others discover that recovery is not a return to who they were before, but the gradual emergence of a different relationship to themselves and to what happened. Trauma influences a life. It need not become the definition of that life. This distinction protects us from a subtle danger in contemporary psychological culture, constructing an identity entirely around injury. A wound deserves recognition. It does not deserve ownership of the whole person. And perhaps this is where the possibility of integration first appears. The traumatic past cannot be made not to have happened. Its facts cannot be negotiated away, but its position within psychological life can change. What once appeared everywhere can acquire boundaries. What once existed only as terror can acquire language. What once erupted as an eternal present can gradually receive a date. Healing begins, perhaps, when the mind no longer has to confuse remembering danger with being in danger. The past remains part of the story, but it begins, finally, to become past. From trauma to psychopathology. If trauma is a rupture in the experience of safety, post-traumatic stress disorder is one possible way in which that rupture may become organized into persistent psychopathology. The distinction is essential. Trauma and PTSD are not synonyms. A person may experience an event involving profound threat, violence, injury, or horror and never develop PTSD. Another may experience significant post-traumatic symptoms for a period of time and gradually recover. For others, symptoms persist and begin to interfere substantially with relationships, work, sleep, concentration, emotional life, and the capacity to experience the present as safe. Psychiatric diagnosis enters at this point not to define the meaning of the entire experience, but to identify a recognizable pattern of suffering. In contemporary diagnostic systems, PTSD is characterized by several interconnected dimensions: unwanted re-experiencing of the traumatic event, avoidance of reminders associated with it, persistent alterations in emotional and cognitive life, and a continuing state of heightened threat or reactivity. These categories sound clinical. Their lived reality is anything but abstract. A memory arrives without invitation. A nightmare reconstructs what consciousness tries to avoid during the day. A particular street becomes impossible to walk down. A conversation is abandoned because one word, gesture, or tone of voice approaches something unbearable. Sleep becomes shallow because vigilance refuses to surrender control. A sudden noise produces a bodily reaction before its harmless origin can be recognized. The person may understand that the danger has passed while simultaneously living as though danger remains imminent. Again, we encounter the central paradox. Chronological time has moved forward, while part of psychological life remains organized around an earlier threat. Intrusion, when the past enters the present. One of the defining features of post-traumatic psychopathology is intrusion. Traumatic material does not always wait to be deliberately remembered. It can enter consciousness involuntarily through distressing memories, dreams, images, physiological reactions, or episodes of intense re-experiencing. The flashback represents perhaps the clearest example of our theme. It is often casually used to mean a vivid memory, but clinically the phenomenon can be more radical. During severe re-experiencing, the ordinary distinction between memory and present perception may become temporarily weakened. The individual may feel or act as though aspects of the traumatic event were occurring again. This helps us understand why the instruction, "Just remember that it is over," can be so inadequate. At the level of reflective knowledge, the person may already know this. The problem lies elsewhere. The traumatic response is being activated in a form that does not fully obey reflective knowledge. A smell can become danger. A sound can become danger. A bodily sensation can become danger. Even an internal state, rapid heartbeat, dizziness, helplessness, sexual arousal, anger, can become associated with the original threat and later trigger fear in its own right. The world becomes populated with echoes. Avoidance, the geography of fear. If intrusion describes the unwanted return of traumatic experience, avoidance describes the attempt to prevent that return. The logic is understandable. If remembering causes overwhelming distress, do not remember. If a place activates fear, avoid the place. If intimacy awakens vulnerability, avoid intimacy. If sleep brings nightmares, resist sleep. If feeling brings pain, stop feeling. Avoidance can therefore provide immediate relief. And precisely because it works in the short term, it can become remarkably persistent. Yet every avoided territory may gradually reduce the dimensions of a person's life. A street disappears from the map, then a neighborhood, then crowds, then travel. then relationships, then difficult conversations. Eventually, safety can become dependent upon making the world smaller. This is one of the cruel paradoxes of avoidance. The strategy designed to protect life from fear can slowly organize life around fear. The person survives by not approaching what feels dangerous, but in doing so may lose opportunities to discover that some forms of danger are no longer present. The altered inner world. Trauma does not affect only fear. It can alter the way a person interprets the self, other people, and the world. I should have prevented it. I am weak. No one can be trusted. The world is dangerous. Something in me has been permanently damaged. If I let my guard down, it will happen again. Such beliefs may arise after traumatic experience and become woven into identity. Alongside them may appear guilt, shame, emotional detachment, diminished interest, difficulty experiencing positive emotion, or a sense of estrangement from others. This is particularly important because trauma can become self-perpetuating not only through memory, but through meaning. If I come to believe that the world is fundamentally unsafe, I will notice danger more readily. If I believe that others cannot be trusted, ambiguous behavior will more easily appear threatening. If I believe that I am permanently damaged, ordinary difficulties may become evidence confirming the verdict. Experience begins to organize itself around the conclusions drawn from previous experience. The wound acquires a worldview. Hyperarousal, the sentinel who cannot sleep. Another central dimension of post-traumatic stress involves persistent activation of systems concerned with threat. The person may become unusually vigilant, easily startled, irritable, unable to concentrate, or unable to sleep peacefully. Anger may appear suddenly. The environment may be continuously scanned for possible danger. We might imagine this as an internal sentinel. During the traumatic situation, the sentinel had an obvious task. Do not let it happen again. The problem is that the sentinel does not necessarily receive a clear message when the emergency is over. It continues watching. At night, during conversations, in crowded places, in intimate relationships, even during moments that should be peaceful. This makes hypervigilance exhausting. The organism is asked to inhabit ordinary life while remaining partially prepared for catastrophe. What looks from the outside like overreaction may, from within the traumatic system, feel like responsible preparation. The person is not necessarily asking, is danger present? The deeper system is asking, can I afford to assume that it is not? PTSD and complex PTSD. Not all traumatic conditions arise from the same kind of experience. A single catastrophic event and years of repeated interpersonal threat may both produce post-traumatic symptoms, but the psychological landscapes they create are not necessarily identical. This distinction has become especially important in the concept of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or complex PTSD. The ICD-11 recognizes complex PTSD as a diagnosis related to, but distinct from, PTSD. In addition to the core features of PTSD, complex PTSD includes persistent disturbances in three broader areas: difficulty regulating emotion, a deeply negative sense of self, and significant problems in sustaining relationships. These additional features are sometimes described collectively as disturbances in self-organization. This formulation is particularly useful when considering prolonged or repeated trauma from which escape is difficult or impossible. For example, chronic childhood maltreatment, prolonged domestic violence, captivity, torture, or other enduring situations of interpersonal domination and threat. The distinction is not simply that complex PTSD means more severe PTSD. Its emphasis is broader. The traumatic consequences have entered the organization of the self. Emotion becomes difficult to regulate. Shame may become pervasive rather than episodic. Relationships may repeatedly activate expectations of rejection, danger, abandonment, or exploitation. The person may not merely remember traumatic experiences. They may have learned who they believe themselves to be through them. Here, trauma approaches personality. And this will become important later in our journey through the inner landscapes, particularly when we examine borderline and narcissistic wounds. A necessary diagnostic distinction. There is, however, an important difference between contemporary diagnostic systems. Complex PTSD is explicitly recognized in the ICD-11 as a separate disorder. The DSM-5-TR does not contain a separate diagnosis of complex PTSD. Its diagnostic architecture organizes post-traumatic symptoms differently, and some phenomena associated with complex trauma may appear within PTSD presentations or alongside other diagnoses. This difference reminds us of something easy to forget. Diagnostic systems are maps, not the territory itself. Maps are indispensable. They allow clinicians and researchers to communicate, compare observations, investigate treatments, estimate prevalence, and identify patterns that might otherwise remain invisible. But no map contains every stone, river, shadow, or path in the landscape it represents. A diagnosis can tell us something important about the forms suffering has taken. It cannot tell us the entire story of the person who suffers. The danger of seeing trauma everywhere. As public awareness of trauma has grown, the language of trauma has expanded far beyond psychiatry and clinical psychology. Much of this development has been valuable. Experiences once minimized or hidden have received recognition. The psychological consequences of violence, abuse, neglect, war, displacement, and chronic interpersonal threat are taken more seriously than in previous generations. But every useful concept risks losing precision when it becomes culturally ubiquitous. Not every painful experience is trauma. Not every conflict is abuse. Not every unpleasant memory is traumatic memory. Not every period of emotional distress is PTSD. If the concept becomes broad enough to include every disappointment, rejection, argument, failure, embarrassment, or difficult childhood memory, it eventually loses the ability to distinguish forms of suffering that require different kinds of understanding. There is also another danger. When every difficulty is interpreted through trauma, the individual can gradually become understood primarily as the product of injury. Agency disappears. Temperament disappears. Choice disappears. Culture, biology, relationships, chance, resilience, moral conflict, and ordinary human contradiction disappear. Everything becomes the wound. A psychologically mature understanding must resist both extremes. We should neither minimize traumatic suffering nor allow trauma to become a universal explanation of human life. Between denial and overextension lies a more difficult position. Precision with compassion. The question beneath the diagnosis. A diagnostic manual asks necessary questions. Which symptoms are present? How long have they persisted? How severe are they? Do they cause significant impairment? But the clinical encounter eventually asks another kind of question. What happened to this person? And beneath even that question lies another. How did this person survive what happened? The difference is subtle but profound. The first question searches for pathology. The second searches for history. The third searches for adaptation. Together, they allow us to see something that diagnosis alone cannot show. Symptoms may be simultaneously sources of suffering and remnants of strategies that once protected psychological survival. To understand trauma fully, therefore, we must move beyond classification. We must ask how the idea of traumatic memory emerged, how psychology came to understand dissociation, why overwhelming experience may resist integration, and how our earliest relationships help construct the very capacity to feel safe. For that, we must return to some of the thinkers who first entered this territory. To Pierre Janet, for whom traumatic experience and dissociation were inseparable questions. To Sigmund Freud, who struggled with repetition, memory, defense, and the strange persistence of what consciousness cannot simply leave behind. And later, to John Bowlby and Donald Winnicott, who helped us understand that psychological safety is not created in isolation. Before safety becomes something within us, it is often something that exists between us. From Janet to Freud, the discovery of the traumatic mind. Long before contemporary neuroscience began mapping the circuits of fear and memory, clinicians were confronted with a disturbing observation. Some experiences seemed unable to enter ordinary memory. They returned instead as symptoms. A paralysis without an identifiable neurological lesion, a bodily sensation without an apparent medical explanation, a recurring image, a nightmare, an inexplicable terror, a state of consciousness seemingly disconnected from ordinary identity. The body and mind appeared to be speaking about something that the person could not simply narrate. Among the earliest thinkers to explore this territory systematically was the French psychologist and physician Pierre Janet. For Janet, psychological integration was central to mental health. Experience ordinarily becomes connected with the larger organization of consciousness. It is recognized, contextualized, and incorporated into the person's continuing sense of self. Under overwhelming conditions, however, this integrative capacity may fail. The experience does not simply disappear. It becomes insufficiently integrated. Parts of memory, emotion, perception, or action can become separated from the ordinary stream of consciousness and later return in intrusive or seemingly autonomous forms. This was one of the foundations of the psychological concept of dissociation. From this perspective, trauma creates a peculiar problem. The person has experienced something that psychologically cannot yet be fully possessed as experience. It belongs to them. And yet, in another sense, it has not become fully theirs. It exists within psychological life, without having found its proper place within the story of that life. Here we encounter once again the problem of time. An integrated memory can be located. It happened then. A dissociated traumatic fragment may carry a different message. It is happening now. Breuer and Freud, suffering from reminiscences. At approximately the same historical moment, Joseph Breuer and Sigmund Freud were confronting related phenomena in patients diagnosed with hysteria. Their famous formulation was striking. Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. The sentence belongs to the 19th century, and the diagnostic world surrounding it is very different from our own. Yet the intuition remains powerful. The past can become pathogenic when it cannot be adequately integrated into the present organization of psychological life. In studies on hysteria, symptoms were explored not merely as meaningless disturbances, but as phenomena possessing histories. A symptom could be connected with experiences, affects, conflicts, or memories that were not readily available to ordinary consciousness. This represented an enormous conceptual shift. The symptom was no longer merely an error to be removed. It could be approached as something with meaning. It had a biography. This idea would become one of the enduring contributions of the psychodynamic tradition. A symptom may be irrational from the standpoint of the present, while becoming intelligible when viewed in relation to the past. The question therefore changes. Instead of asking only, how do we eliminate this symptom? We begin to ask, what history is this symptom carrying? Nachtraglichkeit, when the present changes the past. Freud's thinking introduced another idea that is particularly important for understanding trauma and time. Nachtraglichkeit, often translated as deferred action, afterwardness, or deferred effect. The concept is subtle and easily oversimplified. It does not merely mean that an event happens and produces symptoms years later. Something more psychologically interesting can occur. An earlier experience may acquire a new and potentially traumatic significance only in the light of later development or later experience. In other words, psychological meaning does not always travel in one direction, from past to present. The present can reorganize the meaning of the past. An experience that could not originally be understood may later be interpreted differently when the person possesses new knowledge, new developmental capacities, or encounters another event that changes the significance of what happened before. The past itself has not changed, but its place within psychological reality has. This complicates the ordinary picture of memory. We tend to imagine biography as a book written sequentially. Page 1 is completed before page 2, and what has been written remains fixed. Psychological life is less orderly. Later chapters can alter the meaning of earlier ones. A childhood experience may look entirely different when remembered from adolescence. An adolescent experience may acquire another meaning in adulthood. A relationship may be reinterpreted after betrayal. An apparently isolated event may become recognizable as part of a pattern only years later. We do not merely carry the past into the present. The present continually interprets the past. This does not mean that memory is infinitely malleable or that any interpretation is equally true. It means that autobiographical experience is not simply stored. It is organized through meaning, and meaning develops through time. Repetition, the past reenacted. Freud later encountered another phenomenon that challenged a simple model of psychological pleasure and avoidance. Human beings sometimes repeat what causes them suffering. They return to similar relationships, recreate familiar conflicts, find themselves occupying recognizable emotional positions, or repeatedly encounter versions of an old drama without consciously intending to do so. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud developed the idea of a repetition compulsion while thinking about traumatic neurosis, dreams, play, and recurring patterns of experience. The concept should be handled carefully. People do not seek abuse because they secretly desire to suffer. Nor does every repeated destructive pattern represent a literal repetition of trauma. But Freud's broader observation remains psychologically important. What has not been psychologically mastered may return in forms other than deliberate memory. Sometimes the past is remembered, sometimes it is avoided, and sometimes it is enacted. A person who grew up needing constantly to anticipate another's mood may later find themselves extraordinarily sensitive to emotional changes in intimate relationships. Someone for whom affection was unpredictable may repeatedly experience stable affection as strangely lifeless, while emotional uncertainty feels intensely compelling. Someone who learned that closeness eventually produces pain may unconsciously help create distance at precisely the moment intimacy becomes possible. From the outside, these patterns may appear self-defeating. From inside their history, they may feel familiar. And familiarity is psychologically powerful. The familiar is not always safe, but it is known. Trauma and the protective barrier. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud also offered one of his most evocative metaphors for trauma. He imagined the mental apparatus as protected by a kind of barrier against excessive stimulation. Trauma occurs when the intensity of excitation breaches this protective shield and overwhelms the system's capacity to bind or manage what has entered. The neurological language of contemporary science is very different from Freud's speculative model. Yet the metaphor remains useful. Trauma involves too much, too fast, with too little possibility of psychological organization. Something exceeds the capacity available at that moment. This formulation also reminds us that the same event cannot be understood independently of the person experiencing it. Capacity is not constant. A child and an adult do not possess the same psychological resources. A person who is alone and a person surrounded by reliable support do not encounter danger under identical psychological conditions. An event from which one can escape differs from an event endured in helplessness. An experience that can immediately be spoken about may be processed differently from one surrounded by secrecy, disbelief, shame, or threat. Trauma, therefore, cannot be reduced simply to the magnitude of the external event. We must also consider the relationship between the event and the person's capacity to respond to it. From drive to relationship. Classical psychoanalysis placed enormous emphasis on internal conflict, defense, unconscious fantasy, and instinctual life. Later psychoanalytic and developmental traditions increasingly emphasized something equally fundamental. The mind does not develop alone. Human psychological regulation begins in relationship. An infant cannot independently regulate intense fear, hunger, discomfort, or arousal. Regulation initially occurs through another person, through holding, voice, rhythm, responsiveness, facial expression, touch, predictability, and repeated experiences of distress followed by relief. Before safety becomes an abstract belief, it is an experience. And before it becomes an internal capacity, it is often borrowed from another nervous system. This shift brings us toward John Bowlby and attachment theory. For Bowlby, attachment was not merely sentimental closeness. It was a biologically significant system organized around protection and proximity. Under threat, the child seeks an attachment figure. The caregiver becomes what Bowlby called a secure base from which the child can explore the world, and to which the child can return when frightened or distressed. This gives safety a relational structure. The world becomes explorable because there is somewhere psychologically safe to return. When the secure base is not secure, the implications for trauma are profound. If safety develops partly through dependable relationships, then repeated relational threat can affect more than isolated memories. It can influence the very expectations through which later relationships are interpreted. When caregivers are sufficiently predictable and responsive, the child gradually learns something like, distress can be survived. Someone may come when I call. My needs do not necessarily destroy relationships. Separation does not always mean abandonment. The world can be explored. Over time, these experiences can become increasingly internalized. But when care is frightening, chaotic, neglectful, humiliating, or radically unpredictable, another kind of learning may occur. I must remain alert. Need makes me vulnerable. Closeness is dangerous. People disappear. Love can become threat without warning. I must manage distress alone. These are not necessarily conscious beliefs. They can become patterns of expectation. The child does not sit down and formulate a theory of human relationships. The child lives one. Winnicott, the environment that holds. Donald Winnicott approached development through another language, but one that fits remarkably well with our exploration. He emphasized the importance of the holding environment, the sufficiently reliable physical and emotional environment through which the infant's developing self can gradually acquire continuity. To be held in this sense means more than being physically carried. It means existing within conditions sufficiently dependable that psychological development does not have to be organized primarily around managing overwhelming intrusion or environmental failure. This offers us another way of thinking about trauma. Trauma may involve not only the presence of something terrible, it may also involve the absence of what should have been there. Protection, recognition, comfort, predictability. Someone who believed what happened. Someone who returned. Someone who noticed. Someone who could bear the child's fear without requiring the child to bear theirs. Sometimes the wound is an event. Sometimes the wound is an environment. And sometimes it is the repeated discovery that no one is coming. Safety before words. This developmental perspective helps explain why some traumatic reactions are difficult to resolve through intellectual understanding alone. Some forms of learning precede language. Long before a child can say, "I am safe," the organism is already learning what safety feels like. Long before a child can formulate "people can be trusted," patterns of interaction are shaping expectations about proximity, distress, and response. This is why psychological safety is not merely a proposition. It is also a state. A person may intellectually believe this relationship is safe, and yet experience closeness as threatening. They may know, "I am allowed to rest," yet feel anxious when vigilance decreases. They may understand, "I do not have to earn affection," yet experience unconditional care with suspicion. The contradiction is not evidence of stupidity or unwillingness. Different levels of psychological organization may have learned different things. Healing, therefore, requires more than replacing a false sentence with a correct one. The organism must acquire new experience. Safety must not only be explained, it must gradually become recognizable. From explanation to integration. Janet gave us the problem of failed integration. Brewer and Freud showed how the past could persist through symptoms and how psychological meaning could remain outside ordinary awareness. Freud's concept of Nachtraglichkeit complicated time itself, showing that later experience can reorganize the meaning of what came before. Bowlby showed us that security develops within attachment. Winnicott reminded us that continuity of self depends partly upon an environment capable of holding developing psychological life. Different theories, different vocabularies, different historical moments. Yet a common question runs through them. What allows experience to become part of a life without taking possession of the whole life? Perhaps this is where the concept of integration becomes most useful. Integration does not mean forgetting. It does not mean deciding that what happened was acceptable. It does not require forgiveness. And it certainly does not mean returning to some imaginary untouched self who existed before suffering. Integration means that experience can acquire a place. It can become connected with language, memory, emotion, bodily experience, relationship, and autobiographical time without continually overwhelming the entire psychological system. The memory remains, but it becomes a memory. The scar remains, but it is no longer an open wound. The past remains part of the person, but the person is once again larger than the past. The neurobiology of threat. Modern neuroscience has given us increasingly sophisticated ways of studying what earlier clinicians could observe only through behavior, memory, dreams, symptoms, and the therapeutic relationship. We can investigate networks involved in threat detection, memory, attention, autonomic regulation, and the contextual processing of experience. We can observe how learning changes responses to cues associated with danger, and how those responses may persist after the original threat has disappeared. Yet neuroscience also creates a temptation. Complex psychological experiences can begin to sound deceptively simple when translated into the language of the brain. The amygdala becomes the fear center. The prefrontal cortex becomes the rational brain. The body supposedly stores memories independently of the mind. Trauma becomes a switch that places the nervous system permanently into survival mode. These metaphors may be memorable, but the human brain is not organized like a collection of isolated switches, and trauma cannot be located in a single structure. The reality is more complex and more interesting. Learning danger. One of the most useful ways of understanding post-traumatic reactions is through learning. Imagine that a neutral stimulus repeatedly appears in association with danger. A sound, a smell, a room, a facial expression, a particular time of day, a certain bodily sensation. Through associative learning, something that was previously neutral can acquire the capacity to evoke fear or defensive responding. This principle is not unique to trauma. It belongs to fundamental mechanisms through which organisms learn about their environments. What makes traumatic learning particularly powerful is the intensity and significance of the circumstances under which it occurs. If a cue once predicted severe danger, treating that cue cautiously afterward is not irrational from the standpoint of survival. The nervous system is biased toward an asymmetry. A false alarm is often cheaper than a missed threat. Mistaking a harmless sound for danger may produce unnecessary fear. Mistaking genuine danger for a harmless sound may carry a much greater cost. From an evolutionary perspective, therefore, systems of threat detection do not need to be perfectly accurate. They need to be sufficiently protective. This helps explain why traumatic learning can generalize. The organism may begin responding not only to the original cue, but to stimuli that resemble it. One dangerous person becomes suspicious of similar people. One violent setting makes similar environments difficult. One catastrophic bodily sensation makes later bodily arousal itself frightening. The map of danger expands. The amygdala is not a fear button. The amygdala is frequently invoked in discussions of trauma, sometimes as though it were a small alarm bell hidden inside the brain. Its actual role is more complex. The amygdala participates in networks involved in detecting biologically and emotionally significant information, learning associations, and coordinating responses to potential threat. It interacts with many other brain regions rather than functioning independently. This distinction matters. Fear is not stored in the amygdala, nor does the amygdala simply seize control of an otherwise rational brain whenever someone is triggered. Emotional experience emerges through distributed neural systems interacting with bodily states, perception, memory, context, learning, and interpretation. The language of an emotional brain, fighting a rational brain, may occasionally serve as a rough teaching metaphor. Taken literally, it misrepresents how integrated the brain actually is. Trauma does not divide the brain neatly into primitive and civilized halves. Human beings are more complicated than that. Context and the hippocampus. Another important part of traumatic memory concerns context. Memories normally contain more than isolated sensory fragments. They are situated within networks of information about where, when, and under what circumstances something occurred. The hippocampus plays an important role in memory and contextual processing, although, again, it should not be imagined as a simple storage device. Context allows an organism to discriminate. A sound that meant danger, there does not necessarily mean danger here. A person who resembled an aggressor then is not necessarily the same kind of person now. A racing heart during an attack is not equivalent to a racing heart during exercise. This discrimination is crucial for recovery. The problem in post-traumatic stress is not simply that fear has been learned. It is that cues associated with danger may continue to activate defensive responses in contexts where the original threat is absent. In experiential terms, context provides one of the most important messages the traumatized mind must gradually recover. This resembles what happened, but it is not what happened. Similarity is not identity. The present is not the past. The prefrontal cortex and the myth of pure reason. Popular accounts often place the prefrontal cortex on the opposite side of the story, the rational executive attempting to restrain an irrational emotional system. There is some intuitive appeal to this image, but it is too crude. Prefrontal regions participate in multiple processes relevant to attention, decision-making, regulation, working memory, interpretation, and behavioral control. Their interactions with other neural systems can influence how emotional responses are modulated. But recovery from trauma is not simply a matter of making the prefrontal cortex defeat the amygdala. If it were, Intellectual insight would cure trauma remarkably quickly. And clinical experience tells us otherwise. A person can understand the origin of a reaction in exquisite detail and still experience it. They can explain their childhood, name their triggers, recognize their attachment patterns, understand that a present relationship differs from an earlier one, and still feel terror when intimacy deepens. Knowledge matters. But knowledge is not identical with transformation. The nervous system learns not only through explanation, but through experience. Extinction, learning safety without erasing fear. This brings us to one of the most important ideas in contemporary learning theory: extinction. The word can be misleading. Extinction does not necessarily mean that the original fear memory is erased. Instead, new learning develops. A cue that once predicted danger is repeatedly encountered under conditions in which the expected danger does not occur. Gradually, another association becomes possible. This cue does not always mean threat. The old learning may remain available, but it is no longer the only learning. This helps explain several familiar features of fear. A fear response that has diminished can sometimes return after time has passed, in a different context, or following renewed stress. The return does not necessarily mean that everything learned in therapy has been lost. Rather, older threat learning and newer safety learning can coexist. Recovery, therefore, resembles neither deletion nor amnesia. It is closer to revision. The nervous system acquires additional possibilities. This is remarkably close to the psychological idea of integration we encountered earlier. The aim is not to remove a page from biography. It is to place that page within a larger book. The body and traumatic memory. Few phrases have entered popular discussions of trauma as successfully as the idea that the body remembers. There is an important truth within the phrase. Traumatic experience can involve powerful physiological and sensory motor learning. Changes in heart rate, muscle tension, breathing, startle responses, visceral sensations, posture, and impulses toward defensive action can become associated with threat. A person may therefore experience a bodily reaction before consciously identifying what triggered it. But metaphor should not become anatomy. The body does not contain a separate archive in which complete traumatic memories are stored independently of the brain. What we call bodily memory involves interactions among neural, autonomic, endocrine, perceptual, emotional, and motor processes. The distinction is important because scientific precision does not diminish the embodied reality of trauma. It clarifies it. A trembling hand can be real without containing a hidden narrative. A racing heart can participate in traumatic re-experiencing without possessing a memory of its own. The body participates in memory because the body participates in experience. Fight, flight, and beyond. The language of fight or flight has become almost synonymous with the stress response. Both are important defensive possibilities. But human and animal responses to threat are more varied. Under certain circumstances, defensive behavior may involve freezing, immobility, submission, reduced responsiveness, or other patterns shaped by the nature of the threat and the possibilities available for action. This matters enormously when survivors later judge their own behavior. Why didn't I fight? Why didn't I run? Why did I become completely still? Such questions can become sources of profound shame. But a defensive response is not chosen in the same way one chooses what to eat for dinner. Threat changes the organization of attention and action. The possibilities perceived by the organism in danger may be very different from those imagined retrospectively from safety. To understand this is not to remove all questions of human agency. It is to recognize that agency exists within biological conditions. Sometimes survival looks heroic. Sometimes it looks like escape. Sometimes it looks like resistance. And sometimes, survival looks like doing almost nothing at all. A note on polyvagal theory. No contemporary discussion of trauma would be complete without mentioning polyvagal theory, which has become enormously influential in psychotherapy, popular psychology, and discussions of nervous system regulation. Its language, safety, social engagement, mobilization, shutdown, autonomic states offers many clinicians and patients an intuitive framework for describing lived experience. Yet its popularity should not be confused with complete scientific consensus. Some of its broader clinical metaphors may be useful, while specific evolutionary, anatomical, and physiological claims associated with the theory have been debated and criticized within the scientific literature. This distinction is worth preserving. A model can sometimes be therapeutically evocative without every element of its biological explanation being established. Psychology has repeatedly encountered this problem. We create metaphors to make invisible processes understandable. Then, slowly, we forget that they are metaphors. Scientific maturity requires us to hold useful models lightly. The nervous system is not destiny. Perhaps the most damaging misunderstanding of trauma neuroscience is the idea that trauma permanently rewires the brain in a way that condemns a person to lifelong dysfunction. Experience does change the nervous system. Learning changes the nervous system. Trauma can influence the nervous system. But so can recovery. So can psychotherapy. So can relationships. So can new learning. So can repeated experiences of safety. The same plasticity that allows danger to leave traces also allows new patterns to develop. This does not mean that recovery is simple or inevitable, nor does it mean that every consequence of severe trauma disappears. It means something more modest and more hopeful. The nervous system has a history, but it also has a future. Biology does not invalidate biography. And biography does not end with injury. How does the past become the past? We can now return to the question that has followed us throughout this essay. If traumatic experience persists partly because the present continues to be organized by expectations learned under past threat, what allows change to occur? Not forgetting. Not forcing oneself to move on. Not pretending that the event was less serious than it was. And not endlessly reliving it in the hope that repetition alone will produce healing. Something more delicate is required. The person must gradually become capable of approaching what was previously unbearable while remaining sufficiently anchored in a present that is different from the past. Memory must acquire context. Fear must encounter discrimination. Avoidance must loosen enough for new learning to occur. The body must discover that activation can rise and fall without catastrophe. Relationships may need to demonstrate that closeness does not always end in betrayal, humiliation, abandonment, or violence. And the person may need to discover something perhaps even more difficult. That safety does not mean absolute certainty. No human life can provide that. Psychological safety is not the conviction that nothing painful will ever happen again. It is the growing capacity to experience uncertainty without living permanently as though catastrophe has already begun. This is why recovery from trauma is not merely the reduction of symptoms. It is the reconstruction of temporal trust, the ability to say, "That happened. It mattered. It changed me. But it is not happening now. And perhaps, eventually, my future does not have to be organized entirely by my past." Healing and integration. If trauma can be understood as a rupture in safety, continuity, and the ordinary relationship between past and present, then healing cannot simply mean the disappearance of unpleasant memories. Nor can it mean returning to the person who existed before the traumatic experience. Time does not move backward. The task is different. Healing means developing a new relationship with what cannot be undone. The event remains part of biography. The loss remains a loss. What was violated cannot be made never to have been violated. But psychological life can change around these facts. A memory can become less intrusive. A trigger can lose some of its power. A body that has lived in vigilance can learn moments of rest. A relationship can become a place of connection rather than anticipated injury. A person can remember without completely reliving. The past does not disappear. Its position changes. The many roads of trauma therapy. There is no single therapeutic method appropriate for every traumatized person. Contemporary treatment includes several evidence-based approaches, particularly for PTSD. Trauma-focused cognitive and behavioral therapies, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. EMDR approach traumatic suffering through somewhat different procedures and theoretical languages. It is easy to become preoccupied with their differences. Yet beneath those differences, we can recognize several recurring therapeutic tasks. The person approaches memories, meanings, sensations, situations, or emotions that have become organized around threat. Avoidance is gradually reduced. Traumatic interpretations are examined. Distinctions between past danger and present safety become clearer. Experiences that existed as fragmented, overwhelming, or avoided material can become increasingly contextualized within autobiographical memory. New learning becomes possible. The aim is not to make a person indifferent to what happened. Some experiences should remain sad. Some should remain morally disturbing. Some losses deserve grief. Some violations deserve anger. Psychological health does not require emotional neutrality towards suffering. It requires the ability to experience these emotions without being continually returned to the conditions in which they were born. Exposure is not simply reliving. The role of exposure in trauma treatment is often misunderstood. If avoidance helps maintain fear, then approaching what has been avoided can create opportunities for new learning. But this does not mean that therapeutic success depends upon forcing a person to relive trauma with maximum intensity. The purpose is not psychological flooding for its own sake, nor is suffering itself curative. Therapeutic work must occur within conditions in which traumatic material can be approached without merely reproducing overwhelming helplessness. The distinction is crucial. Repetition is not automatically integration. A person can repeat a traumatic story many times without changing their relationship to it. What matters is what becomes possible during the encounter. Can the memory be experienced while awareness of the present remains available? Can previously avoided meanings be examined? Can guilt or shame be reconsidered? Can the person discover that distress rises and falls? Can a reminder be encountered without the expected catastrophe occurring? Can the experience acquire context? In this sense, therapy does not simply reopen the past. It introduces the past to a different present. EMDR and the search for integration. EMDR has acquired an unusual place in the history of trauma therapy. Its use of bilateral stimulation, particularly guided eye movements, has made it both widely recognized and frequently debated. The clinical evidence supports EMDR as an effective treatment for PTSD. At the same time, questions remain about how much of its therapeutic effect depends specifically upon eye movements or other bilateral stimulation, and how much reflects broader processes shared with other effective trauma-focused treatments. This is a useful reminder that clinical effectiveness and theoretical explanation are not identical questions. A treatment may work even while scientists continue debating precisely why it works. For our purposes, the larger principle is more important. Traumatic material that was once overwhelming and insufficiently integrated becomes approachable under new psychological conditions. The memory is activated, but the person is not where they were when the memory was created. There is now another room, another relationship, another moment in time, another possibility of response. The past is encountered from the standpoint of a present that can survive remembering it. Safety is more than calm. The language of safety appears constantly in trauma therapy, and rightly so. Yet safety can itself be misunderstood. The goal is not to create a life without activation, conflict, uncertainty, grief, or fear. Such a life does not exist. Nor is emotional regulation equivalent to remaining calm at all times. A healthy nervous system is not one that never becomes activated. It is one capable of flexibility. It can mobilize when action is required. It can experience fear without being permanently governed by fear. It can become angry without remaining trapped in anger. It can grieve without losing all access to life. And after activation, it can return. Perhaps this capacity to return is one of the most important dimensions of psychological safety. Not the absence of disturbance, the possibility of finding one's way back. Healing in relationship. Because many traumatic experiences occur within relationships, recovery can also have a relational dimension. This does not mean that every survivor requires another person in order to heal, nor that therapeutic relationships magically repair attachment wounds. But relationships can provide something that isolated insight cannot. They create new interpersonal evidence. Someone listens and does not ridicule. Someone disagrees and does not disappear. Someone sees vulnerability and does not exploit it. Someone respects a boundary. Someone remains predictable. Someone allows closeness without demanding surrender. These experiences may seem ordinary. For a person whose psychological history taught very different expectations, they may be anything but ordinary. A single safe interaction does not erase years of traumatic learning. But repetition matters. The nervous system learned danger through experience. It can also encounter safety through experience. In this sense, healing is not only remembering differently. Sometimes it is being with others differently. The question of forgiveness. Discussions of healing often introduce another word. Forgiveness. It should never be made a psychological requirement. Some people find forgiveness meaningful. It may release them from an exhausting relationship with resentment or become part of spiritual, moral, or existential transformation. For others, forgiveness may be neither necessary nor appropriate. Psychological recovery does not require declaring an injustice acceptable. It does not require reconciliation with an abuser. It does not require renewed contact. And it does not require abandoning anger when anger continues to express a legitimate recognition that a boundary was violated. Healing and forgiveness can meet. They are not synonyms. A person can reclaim a life without absolving the person who injured it. Must trauma make us stronger? Another idea has become increasingly popular: post-traumatic growth. Research and clinical observation suggest that some people report positive psychological changes following profound adversity: deeper relationships, changed priorities, greater appreciation of life, spiritual development, a new sense of personal strength, or altered understanding of what matters. These possibilities deserve attention, but they should not become another burden placed upon survivors. Trauma does not owe us wisdom. Suffering does not automatically ennoble. A person does not have to become stronger, deeper, more spiritual, more creative, or more compassionate in order for recovery to be valid. Sometimes growth occurs. Sometimes the achievement is simpler and no less profound. Sleep returns. A relationship becomes possible. A crowded room becomes tolerable. The nightmare comes less often. A person laughs without immediately waiting for something terrible to follow. Ordinary life returns. There is dignity in that. We should be careful not to romanticize suffering simply because human beings sometimes create meaning from it. The capacity to transform pain is remarkable. The pain itself does not become necessary because transformation was possible. Beyond the identity of the wound, there comes a point in some forms of recovery when another question appears. Who am I if I am no longer organizing my life around what happened to me? This question can be unexpectedly difficult. Trauma may have shaped years of decisions, relationships, fears, explanations, and ways of understanding oneself. Even painful identities can become familiar. To loosen them can create uncertainty. The movement beyond trauma, therefore, involves more than reducing symptoms. It may involve recovering parts of identity that were eclipsed by survival. Curiosity, play, sexuality, ambition, creativity, friendship, solitude that is no longer isolation, rest that is no longer dangerous, the ability to desire something for reasons other than protection. At some point, the central question changes. It is no longer only, how do I prevent the past from happening again? It becomes, what do I want to do with the life that is here now? That question belongs to the future. And the return of the future is itself a form of healing. Integration, giving the past a place. We began with the idea that trauma is not merely an event, but a rupture in the inner sense of safety. We can now add something to it. Trauma may also be understood as a disturbance in the relationship between memory, identity, body, relationship, and time. What cannot be adequately integrated does not simply vanish. It may return as intrusion, be defended against through avoidance, appear as vigilance, enter relationships as expectation, become embodied as defensive readiness, or shape identity through shame, guilt, and beliefs about what the world is and what the self deserves. Integration does not erase these histories. It gives them boundaries. This happened to me. Not to. This is everything that I am. The difference is enormous. The first statement recognizes history. The second surrenders identity to history. Healing creates space between them. When the past finally becomes the past, perhaps we can now understand what it means for the past truly to become past. It does not mean that memory loses all emotional power. There are experiences we may carry for the rest of our lives. A scar does not cease to be a scar because it has healed. It means that memory acquires a location in time. The sound is a sound again. The room is this room. The person before us is not the person who once harmed us. The heartbeat can accelerate without announcing catastrophe. Closeness can contain risk without inevitably becoming danger. And tomorrow becomes something other than the place where yesterday is expected to repeat itself. This is the temporal trust we lost at the beginning of our journey. Not certainty, not invulnerability, not the fantasy that suffering has been permanently defeated. Something quieter, the capacity to inhabit the present without requiring it to answer continuously for the past. Closing reflection. Trauma teaches the mind a terrible lesson. What happened once can happen again. Healing does not answer. No, it cannot. That promise would be impossible. Instead, healing gradually offers another truth. What happened once does not have to be happening forever. The event belongs to history. The memory belongs to the person. But the person belongs also to the present and to possibilities that have not yet occurred. Perhaps this is why healing should not be imagined as forgetting. It is an act of remembering in which time has finally been restored. The past is no longer denied. It is no longer everywhere. It has found its place. And when the past is finally allowed to become the past, something that trauma had once narrowed begins to open again. The future. Healing does not erase the past. It restores the possibility of having a future. at the edge of trauma, toward dissociation. Throughout this exploration, we have repeatedly encountered a word that belongs to trauma but cannot be contained by it. Dissociation. When experience becomes overwhelming, the mind does not always respond by intensifying fear. Sometimes it does something that appears almost opposite. It creates distance. A person may feel strangely detached from the body. The surrounding world may become unreal, dreamlike, or remote. Emotion may suddenly disappear at precisely the moment when we would expect it to become overwhelming. An experience may later be remembered only in fragments. At times, a person may describe the disturbing sense of observing themselves rather than fully inhabiting what is happening. These phenomena remind us that psychological survival does not always require escape from the external situation. When physical escape is impossible, consciousness itself may alter its relationship to experience. When "this is happening to me" becomes unbearable, ordinary consciousness depends upon a remarkable integration that we rarely notice. This is my body. This is happening to me. I am here. This is real. The person who experienced yesterday is the same person who is here today. These statements seem almost too obvious to require explanation. Yet they represent psychological achievements. Experience, body, memory, identity, and reality are ordinarily woven together into a sufficiently continuous sense of self. Under certain conditions, that weaving can loosen. If the experience cannot be escaped, perhaps it can be experienced as though it were happening at a distance. If the emotion cannot be tolerated, perhaps feeling can become numb. If reality becomes unbearable, perhaps reality can temporarily feel unreal. If an experience cannot be incorporated into the ordinary narrative of the self, perhaps it can remain strangely separated from it. From the outside, such responses can appear bizarre. From within the logic of survival, they may represent an extraordinary psychological compromise. If I cannot leave what is happening, perhaps I can leave the experience of being fully present within it. Depersonalization and derealization. Two terms help us describe important forms of this altered experience. Depersonalization refers to a sense of detachment or estrangement from oneself. A person may feel as though they are observing themselves from outside, functioning automatically, or somehow separated from their own body, emotions, or actions. Derealization refers to an altered experience of the external world. Surroundings may feel distant, artificial, dreamlike, visually strange, or somehow unreal, even though the person may recognize that reality itself has not literally changed. This last distinction is crucial. Feeling that the world is unreal is not necessarily the same as believing that the world is unreal. The difference will become particularly important later in our series, when we enter the territory of psychosis. Dissociation can alter the experience of reality without necessarily abolishing the capacity for reality testing. That boundary is clinically important and philosophically fascinating. The paradox of psychological distance. Dissociation introduces another paradox into our understanding of trauma. What protects the person during overwhelming experience may later interfere with the integration of that experience. Distance can preserve functioning, but distance can also make psychological ownership difficult. I know that happened to me, but it does not feel as though it happened to me. I remember the event, but I cannot feel anything about it. I feel the terror, but I cannot connect it with a memory. I see myself in the story, but the person in the story does not feel like me. Here, the problem of trauma becomes more than the persistence of memory. It becomes a problem of belonging. How does an experience become my experience without overwhelming the self that must contain it? How can something be acknowledged as part of one's history without becoming the whole of one's identity? These questions take us beyond PTSD. They lead toward the architecture of consciousness itself. Not every dissociation is trauma. At this point, another boundary is necessary. Just as we resisted seeing trauma everywhere, we should resist explaining every dissociative phenomenon through trauma. Dissociation is not a single experience with a single cause. Transient forms of detachment can occur under stress, exhaustion, panic, intense absorption, and other psychological or physiological conditions. Dissociative symptoms can appear across several psychiatric presentations, and clinically significant dissociative disorders require careful differential assessment. Trauma is an important part of the history of dissociation research and an important pathway through which dissociative symptoms may develop. But association is not identity. This distinction protects us from turning a powerful psychological concept into another universal explanation. The task remains the same: precision with compassion. The divided self. We began this essay with a problem of time. How can something that happened years ago continue to exist psychologically as though it were happening now? We discovered that traumatic experience can disturb memory, threat learning, bodily regulation, relationships, assumptions about safety, and the continuity through which a person inhabits past, present, and future. But dissociation introduces an even deeper question. Perhaps the mind does not always preserve continuity. Perhaps, under conditions it cannot otherwise manage, it survives partly by creating discontinuity. Between memory and awareness. Between emotion and thought. Between body and self. Between experience and identity. Between the person who endured and the person who continued living afterward. This does not necessarily mean that the personality literally breaks into separate persons. The language of a divided self points first to something more fundamental: the possibility that psychological experience can become insufficiently integrated, so that different aspects of what belongs to one life are no longer experienced together. And here our first journey through the inner landscapes reaches its boundary. Trauma asked, what happens when safety is broken? Dissociation asks, what happens when the mind protects continuity by interrupting continuity itself? That paradox will lead us into our next exploration. Dissociation, the divided self.